body and grinding down the
Okay, we'll start with this per tweet from Michael Benson. Canelo Alvarez versus Jermall Charlo is reportedly being discussed to potentially happen in May. It's claimed that Canelo is now much more likely to face Charlo next rather than go up to cruiserweight and challenge Lunga Makabu, according to Mike Cappinger.
So then what's with all the Charlo versus Plant stuff?
Why did Jermall Charlo post a graphic of himself boxing Caleb Plant, and why did Caleb Plant do the same very recently?
I told you in my last video, there's a lot of confusion between 160 and 168 pounds.
Let's just, for argument's sake, assume that Canelo Alvarez's very next fight is Jermall Charlo. What do I think about that? Well, I told you guys that most of these fighters that want to take a shot at Canelo Alvarez, they're interchangeable with each other. Their career exploits,
their marquee value,
or the lack thereof, I should say, makes them indistinguishable from each other. I'm okay with Canelo versus Charlo the same way I'm okay with Canelo versus Benavidez, the same way I was okay with Canelo versus Makabu, Dimitri Bivol, Artur Beterbiev,
or Joe Smith Jr. I'm okay with all of it.
I will say the tougher tests for Canelo Alvarez lie not in the middleweight division or even the super middleweight division. That much is established. The tougher tests for Canelo lie in the light heavyweight division. Though if Canelo Alvarez, after having become an undisputed champion in the super middleweight division, making that history, wants to take his foot off the gas a bit,
he earned it.
More so than many others and more so than his contemporaries, as he's been more active in the last year or so, 2 years really, than they have.
Jermall Charlo is a tune-up fight.
He poses the least risk to Canelo Alvarez, and
that ain't the first time you'll have heard me say that.
I've been saying that from the get-go. I've been saying that from the very beginning.
Jermall Charlo is a tune-up fight.
This could be a commercially successful fight in the state of Texas, where we know Jermall Charlo has some followers, some supporters, and of course, Canelo Alvarez, he's got a lot of supporters down there too.
Jermall Charlo fucking sucks.
But in spite of Jermall Charlo being as basic and ordinary a boxer as he is, having such an uneventful reign as a champion as he has had, there was some demand in circles, small ones, to see Canelo Alvarez face him, to see Canelo Alvarez...
Don't forget that there were narrative pushes out there saying that Canelo is ducking this guy.
Don't forget that not that long ago, there was some demand in some circles, small ones, to see Canelo Alvarez fight this guy.
Well, here it is. I hope you're happy.
I maintain my original position. I'm okay with Canelo fighting Jermall. I'm okay with Canelo fighting David or Dimitri or Artur or Lunga.
You know, there were people calling Lunga Makabu a cherry pick.
Yeah, they wanted me and you to believe that somehow Jermall Charlo would have posed a greater challenge and a stiffer task.
Oh, he's stiffer competition based on what?
Don't forget that from the moment Canelo Alvarez versus Lunga Makabu became a talking point, there were a lot of fight fans right here stateside trashing Lunga Makabu in spite of Lunga being a naturally bigger man, a cruiserweight.
All those guys who were saying that it's cherry pick and Jermall Charlo's a better fighter.
Now the news is that Canelo Alvarez is going to be fighting that better fighter, so I hope you're happy. Hope you guys are happy that you got what you wanted.
Better fighter my fucking ass.
I actually viewed the Lunga Makabu fight as a more interesting fight, a more intriguing fight than, say, a Jermall Charlo fight, because Lunga Makabu is a reigning cruiserweight champion. If Canelo Alvarez were to have fought him, it would have been for a world title. Whereas in the case of Jermall Charlo, the only titles on the line are going to be the ones Canelo already holds at super middleweight, where this fight will presumably take place.
Jermall's basic.
But there were quite a few harsh critics out there when that Lunga Makabu fight was first proposed. Quite a few harsh critics trashing Lunga Makabu and recommending that Canelo Alvarez fight Jermall Charlo in his place, because for some reason in their minds, Jermall Charlo is supposed to be a better fighter.
That's tribalism talking, not boxing.
I guess this puts that entire Charlo versus Plant conversation on the back burner.
Jermall Charlo's a basic fucking fighter.
That's what he's proven to be all these years as a middleweight. He's got Basic power.
Basic.
Decent speed.
He's not lightning fast.
These haven't been standout qualities for Jermall Charlo in the middleweight division.
Power is so-so.
Decent jab, decent speed. As far as durability, there is a question hanging over Jermall Charlo's head at middleweight, it being that his durability really hasn't been tested.
We don't know how much this guy could take at middleweight because he hasn't fought very many good fighters there.
Big punchers. The same rings true for Jermall Charlo's ring IQ. How many tight spots in tight situations?
How many times has his ring savvy availed him against elite opponents?
At junior middleweight, at middleweight, ring savvy.
Sometimes the guy's a bigger puncher than you are.
Sometimes he's a naturally bigger guy than you are. Sometimes he's faster.
We've seen Canelo Alvarez in these situations.
That is the year mark of eliticism in boxing, elite level boxing. Canelo Alvarez has fought opponents with fast hands, naturally bigger, more statuesque fighters than himself.
In some instances.
While Canelo Alvarez moved up from middleweight to super middleweight, a brief stint at light heavyweight, back down to super middleweight, that whole time, Jermall Charlo has been perched in the middleweight division.
Most people don't take into account how long he's been there.
Something like 3 or 4 years fighting fucking nobodies.
Nobodies.
The worst part is, Jermall Charlo, if he wanted it, he had access to some of the who's who guys in the super middleweight division at that time. Him being a PBC fighter, he was on the same side of the street as a Caleb Plant, on the same side of the street as a David Benavidez, and if he wanted to, he could have moved up there, garnered some experience so he could make his bones as a super middleweight, yet he chose the path of least resistance. He chose to stay at middleweight to fight guys like Juan Montiel.
And this is why preserving yourself till something big rolls around is a bad idea.
But that's what he did, and very soon he may be so confronted with a better fighter than any fighter that he's fought before. One of the best fighters, if not the best boxer in the entire sport of boxing. He's going to be like a deer in the headlights. That's my prediction, because I told you. Jermall Charlo, for a guy like Canelo Alvarez, he's a tune-up fight.
There were people out there that really wanted me and you to believe that Canelo was avoiding this guy.
People that are now feeling a sense of impending doom. They don't seem to be celebrating this momentous news that Jermall Charlo may end up getting a Canelo fight after all.
I thought that's what you wanted.
Jermall Charlo is a very basic, no-frills boxer puncher with so-so power, a decent jab, decent speed.
Durability is questionable.
His ring savvy is questionable. Oddly enough, he's got a bigger, much bigger frame than Canelo Alvarez, who is a shorter, stumpier fighter than Jermall Charlo is. Jermall has the kind of frame to where he could have moved up to super middleweight to make his bones a long time ago, and he would have been more adequately prepared for this fight. But he chose to stay at middleweight.
Hell with the tape. He's got a bigger frame than Canelo.
More height, more reach, though that's not much of an edge. That's not saying much, since Canelo Alvarez won't be in unfamiliar territory against a more statuesque fighter than himself. Rocky Fielding, Callum Smith, Caleb Plant, Sergey Kovalev.
Billy Joe Saunders were all taller, more statuesque fighters than Canelo.
And he stopped them all, while Jermall Charlo failed to stop the likes of a Brandon Adams, a junior middleweight who moved up to middleweight, failed to stop the very unheralded Juan Montiel, who was once stopped by Jaime Munguia. The aesthetic I envision, the aesthetic I see in association with this match is a similar aesthetic to what we saw in the Daniel Jacobs fight, with the difference being that Daniel Jacobs has a better, more robust middleweight resume than Jermall Charlo has amassed in 3 or 4 years campaigning as a middleweight. I view the Daniel Jacobs that Canelo Alvarez fought 2 or 3 years ago as a more dynamic fighter than the Jermall Charlo that stands before us here today, though the aesthetic,
the discrepancy in height between Canelo and Daniel Jacobs
is about the same as the discrepancy in height between Canelo and Jermall Charlo. Thus, the implementation from Canelo Alvarez may be similar. Coming forward in that high guard, catching and shooting and pressuring Jermall Charlo, getting that guy to throw based on Canelo's proximity to him,
so that Canelo can counter what Jermall puts out there.
I think Canelo Alvarez has the edge in speed, a slight edge in speed, and I know he's the stronger, more durable puncher. Couple that with Canelo Alvarez's upper body movement, angling off to get under and or around straight punches and sweeping hooks, similar to what we saw in the Daniel Jacobs fight. People tend to forget that Canelo Alvarez is a counter puncher, and he's got some of the best upper body movement in the business.
Jermall Charlo might get stopped.
At super middleweight, where Canelo Alvarez has shown he's a very strong finisher.
You gotta remember, Caleb Plant is a defensive fighter.
Economic and completely defensively minded. Canelo Alvarez was able to stop him.
Able to stop a defensively minded moving target.
A harder target, I think, than Jermall Charlo. Jermall is not as defensively minded as Caleb Plant. Caleb is more akin to a pure boxer, whereas Jermall, he's more of a boxer-puncher.
Canelo lives somewhere in between a boxer-puncher and a pressure fighter.
He can be both depending on who man opposite the ring is. And in this situation, he's obviously fought better fighters than Jermall Charlo has. Obviously fought better fighters than Jermall Charlo.
You guys wanted this souped-up hype job to get this fucking fight.
Well, here it is. I hope you're happy. Just in reference to Canelo Alvarez's potential ring return, Showtime had Stephen Espinoza on Canelo's return to the network. It elevated his events back to where they belong.
Elevated his events. He broke the indoor record without you.
I think it was important for the sport, Espinoza said of Alvarez's return on an episode of the PBC podcast. It was obviously important for Showtime. It allows us to continue the business we started with him back in 2013 and 2014, but it also elevated his events back to where they belong.
What do you mean, behind your paywall?
Because that's the only real difference between Canelo Alvarez fighting on the DAZN platform and fighting on your platform. You get to charge an arm and a leg every time he gets out there, and that benefits you more than it benefits the customers, the consumers, and the fight fans that were watching all Canelo Alvarez's fights on DAZN.
That's the only real difference.
Stephen said, along the way I heard, and this is going to sound strange to a hardcore boxing fan, but there were comments among his core base, Mexican and Mexican-American fans, not the hardcore followers of boxing, but the fans that show up for big Mexican Independence Day fights, who watch a couple of times a year, and I heard from some of them, what happened to Canelo? We thought he had retired there for a couple of years, Espinoza said, and he just wasn't as much a part of the mainstream as his events should have been, and that's no fault of Canelo. His star power is as strong as ever.
Oh, it is? And what the hell are you talking about?
You're telling me that when Canelo Alvarez was on his undisputed run, his core fans didn't know?
Then how are we supposed to be sure those are core fans of Canelo Alvarez?
This is a contradiction, an oxymoron, if it's anything. You're telling me that Canelo Alvarez's core supporters didn't know.
You're telling me his fans thought he retired because he wasn't boxing on your platform.
So then why did so many of them show up to see him fight Billy Joe Saunders? Certainly it wasn't because of Billy Joe Saunders, a UK import.
Stephen Espinoza's full of shit.
Stephen Espinoza, who said he wasn't in the mainstream media as much as he should have been, it felt right. It generated the type of attention, the type of gate, the type of pay-per-view that he should have been all along. He certainly didn't lose anything in the meantime. I think our credibility and our marketing expertise were able to elevate his events back to where they should be. Those types of mega events that everyone tunes into every year. And yet more people showed up to see Canelo fight on DAZN than they showed up to see him fight on your platform.
He broke the indoor record with Billy Joe Saunders on DAZN.
Now, how would that many of people known to come to a Canelo Alvarez fight based on your story that entails his core supporters not knowing if he's still boxing, his core supporters, they thought he retired. Then how did so many of them show up to see him fight Billy Joe Saunders?
You know what Canelo Alvarez said? He said he relished the opportunity to fight in front of that many people.
According to Canelo Alvarez, the Caleb Plant fight might have been a little bit bigger because that was the fight that was for the undisputed super middleweight championship. But he himself relished the opportunity to box in front of 70+ thousand people. He relished the opportunity to box in front of that many of his supporters, and he didn't do that with you guys.
According to you guys, 70,000 people shouldn't have even been there because his core supporters thought he retired.
Stephen Espinoza is a weasel and a snake oil salesman. What was an obstruction to the Anthony Joshua versus Deontay Wilder fight, all caught in the middle when he's a network executive who's
a network exec who thinks he's a boxing promoter.
I'm sure that given the numbers they've been putting up thus far the last 2, 3, 4 years, given those numbers.
With Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury 1.
All of Gervonta Davis's shit shows, especially the last one.
Yeah, I'm sure that Stephen's real happy to be working with an actual megastar, a bona fide pay-per-view attraction in the sport of boxing.
Because that's what those guys ain't. After many of the PBC's A-listers migrated over to Fox when that landmark deal was struck, Errol Spence Jr.,
Keith Thurman, Deontay Wilder.
The PBC didn't really leave Showtime with all that much when that first happened, when that situation first took place,
Pure happenstance that Canelo Alvarez ended up over there. Pure happenstance.
PBC just so happens to have had a couple of guys at or around super middleweight for Canelo Alvarez to fight. It's got absolutely nothing to do with Showtime's marketing expertise, because their marketing expertise hasn't been able to put up big numbers for the guys that do box on that network on a regular basis. How long has Gervonta Davis been fighting on Showtime, on pay-per-view?
And he still ain't putting up anywhere near the numbers that Canelo Alvarez is.
Those comments from Stefan Espinoza, they have less to do with Canelo Alvarez and his star power, where his fight should be, and more to do with Stefan taking a jab at the competition, the other platforms, the other game in town.
You'd have to be a fucking blithering idiot to be on this guy's side.
Stefan Espinoza isn't acting on the boxing fans' behalf with their best interests in mind. If anything, he wants to gouge the boxing fans as much as possible.
I saw a couple of freaks and geeks actually celebrating Canelo Alvarez's return to pay-per-view.
But unless you're a Showtime network executive, why exactly would that be cause for celebration?
Why would a paying customer, a boxing fan, be celebrating that?
The PBC shows were very happy that Canelo Alvarez would be boxing under the PBC banner at least once, though I don't know why, since all that means is
it's gonna cost more money to see the guy fight.
That's all it means. That's the only difference between Canelo Alvarez having boxed on DAZN, as long as he was boxing on DAZN, and him boxing on Showtime moving forward for one, maybe two more fights.
Find a proliferation of these people on social media.
These guys that think pay-per-view is the best thing since sliced bread and would prefer that Canelo Alvarez fight on a pay-per-view platform as opposed to the DAZN platform. You can find these guys on Twitter and Instagram. You just won't find these guys in the numbers for a Gervonta Davis fight.
Did you see the numbers for Donaire versus Ubali?
Or the numbers for Donaire versus Gaballo. I mean, the way Stefan Espinoza's been carrying on, you would have thought that those fights and their viewing figures would have been a lot better than what they are. But those viewing figures, they are abysmal. Gervonta Davis, he's been boxing on that network forever, and his numbers are down, not up.
Showtime was so desperate they actually went into the Jake Paul business.
Showtime, as a network in the sport of boxing, has been in such a bad way that after the PBC's A-listers migrated over to Fox, they went into the Jake Paul business of novelty fights. And his last novelty fight, that rematch with Tyron Woodley, it fucking flopped.
Oh, he put up some good numbers, some really good numbers the first time out.
But the rematch, their second meeting, was a box office flop. See, news in the sport of boxing is so fragmented at times, you don't always get the full picture. You can't always really see what's going on. But when you have to go as far as going into business with a glorified internet troll,
A pseudo boxer that doesn't actually box with real boxers.
because for better or worse, he still hasn't. When you have to go that far just to move a couple of units, sell a couple of pay-per-views, well, it says a lot about your situation.
So perhaps Canelo's next fight will be on Showtime.
I'm sure that Stefan Espinoza and the people over there are thanking their lucky stars for that. But make no mistake, it's not due to their marketing expertise. Put simply, it's a happenstance. Pure happenstance.
It's not good news for boxing fans because they want to gouge guys like me and you.
That's why Stefan is in such good spirits.